Okay, we are recording. Got a little bit more than 1 minute. I guess I'll start announcements since we're recording. I know it's a little bit early and we still have some people coming in. So I guess I'll start with the least important announcements. Let me see. Hold on here. Present my screen. Good. Okay. So as some of you noticed on this most recent announcement that I posted last night, if you read at the end of it, it says, if you read this entire announcement, reply to the email to let me know you read it. I'll give you half a point of independent work. Yes, sir. You did? Okay, good. Speaking of which, I haven't checked my emails. I mean, I did a little bit of grading, a little bit of emails over the weekend, but I'm doing a different thing this year. I'm trying to take the weekends off. It's a long story. It's mostly at the request of my wife. But so if you've turned something in or sent an email and wondering why I haven't gotten back to you, that's why. I'm not ignoring you. I'm just taking the weekends off for the most part. That being said, I do keep an eye on my emails. So some of you have sent me important emails that need an immediate response. And for those people, I have responded. So just something to keep in mind. I also did the same thing. If you look here for when I posted the lab, whoops. When I posted it, you'll see here at the bottom, it says, if you read this entire announcement, reply to the email for half a point of extra credit. So that's just a hint. When I post announcements, read them carefully because you might get free points. I'm just throwing points out there. But anyway, yeah, it's now too late to get those free points because I've pointed them out. So for those past announcements, you can no longer reply to them for the free points. But moving forward, keep in mind I do tricky things like that. Not tricky things to hurt you, because I'll never do something tricky that's going to deduct points. But I will do tricky things to give you points, right? So pay attention. All right, let's see. Bowers. Okay, I'm getting there. And then we have Sybil. Yep. And then Eric, right? Okay. Anybody I missed? Everybody's accounted for so far, right? All right, it's 8:01. So anyway, yeah, back to the announcements. Make sure you read the actual announcements that I post, especially that one about the lab. It's important, and we have lab today if you're section 1. If you're section 2, we have lab on Wednesday. But make sure you're there at noon, H205, so it's 2 stories above us, and it's on that side of the building, that corner. And between now and then, hopefully you've done the pre-lab, because as of now, the pre-lab, it's late. But as long as you get it done before I get around to grading it today, I'll consider that on time. Yes. Yes, great.
When it says do not turn in and you click the share button, you're able to see it. So can you see like when everything will stop working?
Yep, great question. Yep. So because it's shared with me, and I'll get to you in a second, because it's shared with me, I have access to it at all times, actually. And that's, you'll see, sometimes that's really helpful because I don't always take the weekends off. So sometimes you'll be working on the pre-lab and I can see that you're working on it. I can hop on while you're working on it, and you might put a wrong answer and I'll say, hey, you might reconsider that. Because until the due date, you can fix any wrong answers, so that's the advantage of doing it online. Any other questions? All right, so yes, like I said, we got Cedric here. Make sure you have it done. And again, if you haven't done it yet, technically it's too late. But like I said, as long as it's done before I get around to grading it, I'm going to consider that on time. Because I don't have time right now to check the date that you started it, right? I don't have that access. So there you go. Any other questions about lab? All right. What else for announcements? I think that's it. Lab this week. I have a lot of emails and grading to catch up on, so you're not being ignored. I think that's all the announcements. All right. Let's jump back into it. We were talking about the scientific process. And remember, I told you what you definitely need to know about the scientific process is what we talked about right before we finished on Friday, which was the steps, right? So you need to know the step 1 is observation. Oh, sorry. One more announcement. That reminds me. For attendance, if you're online, I'm going to say some attendance keywords, and make sure you email me those attendance keywords before 9 a.m. And the first keyword will be staple. And for the rest of you in person, if you want to email me those attendance keywords for a little bit of extra credit, you can do that too. And yes, the first keyword is staple. For those of you who are watching the video, which is nobody live right now, right? So if not of those of you who are online, but those of you who are watching the video later today, take a screenshot every time I say a keyword too. So don't just send the keyword, send the screenshots as well. Any questions about that? Okay, we're getting a late start, guys, sorry. Anyway, we're talking about the scientific process. Step 1, observation or exploration, depending on what you want to call it. Step 2 was question, right? You see something that leads to a question. Step 3 is hypothesis, because a hypothesis is a tentative answer to a question. Step 4 is a prediction, because the prediction describes how you're going to test your hypothesis. And then here's where we get to the next part, which is actually talking about how to do the experiments. And I'm going to kind of go through this quickly, because I'm not necessarily going to test you much on this, but we're going to be doing it all semester long, right? That's the purpose of lab, is for us to do experiments. So again, I'm going to go through it kind of quickly because it's going to be reinforced semester. But the first word you need to understand, 1, because I might test you on it, but 2, because I'm definitely going to use this word a lot, is variables. You need to know what a variable is, or what variables are. They're the factors that change in an experiment. So going back to that weird example I gave you last week about my friends peeing in the yard, and that was the observation that the grass was greener where they pee, and the question would be then, is urine good for grass? You know, the hypothesis could be yes, it's good for grass, and then I could devise an experiment to test that, maybe give different plots of grass different concentrations of urine, right? So in that case, the variable would be different concentrations of urine. This spot got no urine. This spot got 50% water, 50% urine. This spot got 75% water, 25% urine, so on and so forth. That would be the variable. The next word you need to understand is controlled experiment. The next term, I should say. A controlled experiment is one that compares 2 or more groups that differ only in one variable that the experiment is designed to test. So again, using my pee on the grass example, we'd have different groups, right? The group that got no urine, the group that got 50% urine, the group that got 75% urine, so on and so forth. Which brings us to the next concept, which is the control group. That's the group that lacks or does not receive the specific factor being tested. So again, if I was doing this experiment in my yard and just had different spots, different concentrations of urine, I would need to have one group that didn't have any urine. Because what if I do this experiment and all the grass dies, right? At least I can have the control group, and as long as the control group also dies, then I know that it has nothing to do with the urine. Because the control group didn't get any urine. And then, of course, the other group, the opposite, if you will, is the experimental group. That's the one that has or receives the specific factor being tested. So the group of grass that was getting the different concentration of urine in my weird experiment. Are there any questions about what's on this slide? It's a good independent work topic. So obviously, again, other than one person, no one here is a biology major, and no one else is a science major. So you guys probably won't be doing experiments in real life, right? Or in your academic career outside of science classes. But we will be doing these things. So for independent work, what you could do is devise an experiment. But again, because you're not scientists and you're not biologists, you don't necessarily even do the experiment. If you just come up with an experiment and you write a paper about it, like here, this is what the variables would be. Here's the control group would get this, or not get this. The experimental groups would get this, this, and this, right? This is the same way I just described that urine experiment. You could come up with an experiment and write about it. Again, you don't have to do it. You could just write about it. Anyway, any questions about this slide? Try not to go too fast, but you know. You can always slow me down or watch the video. The next word you need to know is independent variable. This is important. It gets a little bit trickier. That's the variable whose change is not affected by any other variable in the experiment. And before I expound on that, let me talk about the next one, and I'm going to talk about them together. The dependent variable is the thing that's being studied and measured in an experiment and changes as a result of changes to the independent variable. So when you're studying these two terms, It's not good to just know the definition of one and the definition of the other. You really need to understand how they're related to each other. And in a sense, the independent variable is the cause and the dependent variable is the effect. And the easy way to remember that is the dependent variable is dependent on what you're doing, which is the independent variable. So for example, in the urine test, again, I could say that, urine is good. The hypothesis is that urine is good for plants, right? So how do I measure good? I can come up with different ways. One way I could do it is measure how long the grass is, right? How tall the grass is. In that case, the dependent variable would be the height of the grass. And the independent variable would be the different concentrations of urine, right? So the different concentrations of urine are causing the effect, which is the different length of the grass. It does get a little bit trickier in some of these experiments because a lot of times the independent variable is also just time. And we'll talk about that when we get there in lab. But anyway, yeah. Any questions about the relationship between dependent and independent variables? All right. And then finally, right here at the bottom, your book points out that a well-designed experiment often tests just one independent variable at a time. So again, if I had this hypothesis that urine is good for plants, let's say I also had a hypothesis, I thought to myself, maybe it's not the fact that it's urine, maybe the fact that it's warm liquid, right? So I could have two hypotheses. Urine is good for plants and warm liquid is good for plants. So in this experiment, I wouldn't want to do, I wouldn't want to use actual fresh urine, right? Because that would be two different variables. I would have the warmth and I also have the different concentrations of urine. I would want to do just one at a time. So first I would test the urine hypothesis. Then I would test the warmth hypothesis. Because if I do them both at the same time and get the results that I was looking for, which one was it? Was it the warmth, or was it the temperature, or was it the concentration of urine? Anyway, any questions about this? All right. Moving forward then. Again, don't feel bad to slow me down. You guys set the pace. All right. Whoops, wrong way. All right, another term you should understand, and I might or might not test you on this, I don't know. We're definitely not going to do it. We don't do those kind of experiments in this class because it's a 100 level non-biology major class. But placebo. Does anybody know what a placebo is? Can someone tell me what a placebo is? You probably know. Some of you have heard it, I'm sure. No guesses? Yes. And if you could send me an email, if you remember, get a little extra credit for guessing correctly. But it is a medically ineffective treatment. That's the book way of saying what you just said, right? So when they did the vaccine trials for COVID-19, not everybody in the study actually got the vaccine. Some people got like a saline shot. That's basically a control, right? That's what a placebo is. It's a control, a medically ineffective treatment. And typically, the placebo group doesn't know it's receiving the ineffective substitute, which is a term I don't think your book brings up, but something called the placebo effect. Because sometimes your mind is so powerful that just by thinking you got the treatment, your body will respond accordingly. Of course, not with a vaccine, but still. So because of that, usually when they do these studies, they don't know, right? The people in those COVID-19 vaccine studies, they didn't know if they were getting the substitute, the placebo, or if they were getting the real thing. Which brings us to that next term, double-blind experiment. That's when no one knows. Well, not no one, but the participants don't know what they're getting, and neither do the people administering it. So again, with the COVID-19 vaccine trials, right? Someone was giving a shot, someone was getting a shot. Neither one of them knew if they were getting the real deal or if they were getting the placebo. Whoops. Yeah. So any questions about placebos? And again, for the exam, for the entire semester, for lab, this is probably one of the least important slides. Because again, this is a 100 level non-biology major course. So we won't be talking about that much. But, again, the purpose of a good education, college education, is for you to be thinkers, right? So when someone presents you with some evidence, you should criticize it and think critically, right? So this is the kind of things you should look for. If someone says, well, they did this study and this were the results, well, read the study, see what the results were. Did they have a placebo? Was it a double-blind experiment? Anyway, let's do that for the next keyword. Double, since it's right there, is the next attendance keyword. So again, if you're online right now, you're going to email me those words sometime before 9 a.m. If you're in person, you can email me those words, I don't know, sometime today for a little bit of extra credit. And if you're watching the video, take a screenshot and send the words. Any questions? You guys are really quiet. You seem like I feel. I'm exhausted. I had a long weekend. Anyway, every chapter of your book has this thing called the process of science. I'm going to skip through it every time, but I highly recommend reading it. If you have questions about it, let me know. The study guides, which again come from the publisher of your textbook, they might have questions about this portion. I will not question you about it on the exam, but again, there might be questions about it on the study guide. So read it. It's interesting, sort of interesting. Let me know if you have questions. All right, that brings us to the next main bullet point here. Evaluating scientific claims. As far as the exam is concerned, this is a very unimportant bullet point because I'm not going to be testing you on much of this. But as far as the purpose of this class and the purpose of an undergraduate degree, this is a very important bullet point. And this is something we're going to do throughout the semester, hopefully. We're going to evaluate scientific claims because that's what you need to be able to do. All right, that brings us to our first word for this term, or excuse me, the first term for this discussion, which is pseudoscience. You should know what pseudoscience is, both the definition and you should be able to recognize it. And this is why I love independent work, because inevitably, a lot of you are going to send me some pseudoscience. You're going to write a paper about some pseudoscience garbage. And that's okay. You're not going to lose points for it. That's just a great way for us to have an exchange. And I can tell you, like, all right, you got full credit for this, but just so you know, this is fake. And here's how you know it, right? And I can point out the things from that paper or the source that you used. It'll be a good learning experience. Anyway, pseudoscience, a field of study that is falsely presented as having a scientific basis. There's several indicators, and you don't necessarily need to write these down because, again, I'm not going to test you on this, but this is something I'll probably share on that Facebook group because these are things you should know, right? You should be able to spot this. Anecdotal evidence. So it's based on single or few examples and don't support the generalized conclusion. That's a big one. Anecdotal evidence is so, so powerful, especially when you think about the COVID-19 vaccine. It's safe, right? Nothing's 100% safe. There have been a few things, there have been some issues with it, but overall, it's riskier to not have the vaccine to have it, right? It's safer to have the vaccine than to not have it. We know that. The numbers show that. But it doesn't matter what the numbers show. If you know somebody who took the vaccine and got sick, even if it wasn't even their fault, even if it wasn't even the vaccine, doesn't matter, right? In your mind, if they said, I took the vaccine and I grew a third nipple, you're like, man, that's anecdotal evidence. Doesn't matter if that's the one out of billions of people that happened to, right? Statistically, that's so small, but you knew what happened to them. So because of that, that's powerful. So anecdotal evidence, which is bad, is a very powerful thing. So be careful about it. Like flying. I used to love flying. I hate it now. And it's because of that anecdotal evidence a little bit, right? So, it's statistically very safe to fly. But you've seen the stories of plane crashes, right? So that's very powerful stuff. Even in my own brain, I know it's safe, but I don't like it. Well, that and I used to fix jets. That's a whole nother story. Anyway, any questions about what anecdotal evidence is? All right, the next one is the source of information. And again, that's going to be a big one with independent work. Another good thing about independent work is because we get to have that exchange. You get to send me sources and I get to nitpick them. And again, it's a 100 level class, so you're probably not going to lose points. Now, granted, I did have a student once who just kept turning in garbage and didn't lose points at first, but eventually I was like, look, you got to stop using this website. This is garbage. So that student would eventually lose points, and you will too if you keep doing the same thing and I keep telling you, no, don't use that one. There's like, for example, all right, there's a website out there. Actually, there's a lot of them where you can ask a question to a group of like a community of people, and they'll provide an answer. Right? There's a lot of websites like that, but that's not a real source. That's just some other dude on the internet giving you an answer. Right? Anyway, so yeah, source of information is very important. Another example of that is I read something. Have you guys heard of the Impossible Burger or the Impossible Whopper? Basically, it's fake meat, right? I read something about high estrogen levels and how it's basically making what was the claim? It was making men more feminine or males more feminine or something like that. I don't even remember. And it looked like real science. Like I had to dig for a while reading this article. Like, that looks pretty legit. And some of it seemed to be, but then I was checking like the source that it was coming from. You know, the guy who wrote that study was a doctor. I was like, a doctor of what? I'm curious now. He was a veterinarian. Nothing wrong with that. Let me get where I was going. Not only was he a veterinarian, but he was president of like the Texas Cattle Association or something. So obviously this guy was biased, right? This guy's like, whoa, these Impossible Whoppers are bad for our business because we grow and sell cows for beef. So yeah, the source of information is important. Another good independent work idea, speaking of which. So again, I keep saying, inevitably, some of you are going to send me some garbage sources, and it's going to be a good learning moment. But that's another thing you can look out for just whenever you're reading stuff or maybe you're online on social media. If you see some garbage and just want to debunk it and send that to me. Like I saw this, it was hilarious, and here's how we know it's garbage, right? You can look at all this. You can send me their source and say, this is why this source is garbage. It was anecdotal evidence, or the source of information was not peer-reviewed, whatever it may be. Anyway, moving forward, getting more specific about this source of information. Was it peer-reviewed, like I just said? So the peer review process, as we talked about on Friday, that's when you do a study, you submit it to people, right? Usually anonymous, and they go over it to see if it seems legit, right? Now, the peer review process is not perfect. Actually, there's a Facebook page I follow called Retraction Watch, because a lot of times peer-reviewed journals or articles are retracted because either they made a mistake or they lied, right? So it's not perfect, but it's still better than a YouTube video, right? You can claim anything. I can get on YouTube and make any claims, especially since I have a master's in biology, right? So I can make all kinds of claims and even make them sound correct. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't lie. But anyway, and again, like I said, is the source of information from a company trying to sell you something. So if you're going to send me something, well, actually, eucalyptus oil is good for your health because of X, Y, and Z, and then you send me a source from www.essentialoilsforsale.com, right? Obviously, that's going to be trying to sell you something. So it's going to be biased. Anyway, any questions about this slide? All right. So again, I'll remind you, for the exam, I might not ask you any of this, but this is really important just for your everyday life. And we're going to go over this throughout the semester. All right. This next slide is like a little table of everything we talked about. So if you were going to print anything out or take any notes, it should be this, because this is nice and compact. It compares real science versus pseudoscience, right? So I'll just talk about this one. Real science adheres to an established and well-recognized scientific method, which is what we've been talking about since Friday. Pseudoscience does not adhere to generally accepted process of science. Oh, I'm going to share a video with you. It's great. There's a lady who's talking about GMO cabbage, which doesn't exist, by the way. We don't have GMO cabbage yet. And she's got this leaf of cabbage, like, look at this. It does not burn. And she puts it on the flame, and sure enough, it does not burn. But that was her experiment. But did she have a control? No. So probably, well, actually, it would, because there's no such thing as GMO cabbage. But had she had non-GMO cabbage in her mind and done the same thing and put it on the flame, it wouldn't have burned either. So anyway, we'll have fun with that, hopefully, throughout the semester. I love finding pseudoscience and making fun of it. Oh, here's another one. So it's a checklist. So here's a thing comparing them, and then you have a checklist. So again, nothing to memorize here. Don't study this, but if you could print this out, that might help you, right? So when you're turning something in for independent work, these are things you want to look at. Anyway, any questions about this? All right. Finally, so we're done with the first main bullet point of the 3 bullet points. And now let's jump into the second one. Like we said on Monday, and this is good, or Friday, and this is a good reminder for the exam. Actually, I'll ask you guys, other than you, since you've already answered one, what is the definition of biology, the way I taught it, the way your book teaches it, the way that's going to be on the exam.
It's fine. Done.
Yes, good. And when you email, or if you could email me, remind me that you guessed that, you get a little bit extra credit. Yes, it's the scientific study of life. So that first bullet point, we just finished talking about what science is. Now, what is life, right? And that's what we're about to talk about now. The properties of life. What is life, right? What distinguishes living from non-living? It's difficult, right? So there is no one definition of what life is. Let me ask you this. Is this computer alive? No. Good guess. You are correct. But why not? I like that. It's not breathing air. But as you'll learn, not everything breathes air. But that's good. And as you'll see as we move forward, now we'll get there later. Any other guesses? What else makes this not alive? No guesses? All right. Doesn't have a heartbeat. That's a great guess too. But when you think about it, neither does a plant, right? Yeah. So we'll talk about it. Here we go. Let's move forward. This is what you need to know. You should study this. This will be on the exam. I might ask you specifically to list these things, or I might give you a list and say which one of these things is not on, or shouldn't be on the list, right? So I'll give you all these plus something that shouldn't be there. Or maybe I'll give you a list of things that are not right and only one of them is going to be correct. So you'll need to pick that out. Or maybe I'll give you some scenario like, all right, you found this thing and you're wondering if it's alive. And I'll give you some information about it. And then you can tell me, I'll ask you, is it alive or not? Or I'll ask you, how do you know it's alive based on what I told you? But anyway, let's talk about it. Order is the first one. That one's tricky. And in some books, I'll tell you. Okay. So if you were to look this question up, what are the properties of life? This is what you need to know for the exam, but depending on your source, it's going to look a little bit different. So if you were to Google this, you might find a different answer. And there's another independent work topic if you want. Look it up. What are the properties of life? But not the way the book describes it, but the way another source describes it. Anyway, order is apparent in, so again, your book has little themes of every chapter, and this chapter is turtles. That's the theme. So it's talking about this in the context of that sea turtle. But order, everything's arranged. It's not random, basically, is what it's saying. And that one's a little bit more tough. We won't even talk much about that. But for example, this is ordered, right? This laptop, it does have one of the properties of life. It is ordered. Laptops are the same. Like I can see back there, I can barely see it, but he has a laptop. I know it's a laptop based on the way it's shaped. Or maybe it's not. Maybe it's a tablet. She has a laptop, right? I don't know. I'm not an expert on what that is, but I can tell it's a laptop because there's order, right? We know that it has certain shapes. The next thing, and this is a big one, cellular. Life is cellular, right? If it's not made of cells, it's not alive. And that's a big one for this computer. This computer is not cellular. And I'm curious to see how things are going to change in the future. Because now with technology changing, we can make artificial cells. So do we consider that alive? Another independent work topic if you want to look into it. But I don't want to get that deep right now because it's a 100 level course. But anyway, life is cellular. So if it has cells, it's alive. Of course, if I give you a question on the exam, that would be really easy. If I said it has cells, you'll know it's alive. But it's going to be a more realistic question on the exam because most of you probably, how many of you have microscopes? Okay. See, so if you find something and you're trying to determine if it's alive, it's not like you can just throw it under a microscope and see if it has cells. So the next one, growth and development, right? Things that are alive grow and develop. Even single-celled organisms like a bacterium, it will grow and develop. Now, granted, you might not be able to see it with your naked eye, and I want to do this sometime in the semester as an extra credit opportunity. If we go on a nature hike, right, and I point out a tree and like, is that alive or not? Of course, we all know trees are alive, but this is one of those things that you couldn't see on the nature walk, right? We can't look at a tree and watch it grow and develop while we're standing there, right? So it can be a little bit tricky, these things. The next one is energy processing. And of course, this doesn't grow or develop either, right? So that's another one of the things that makes it not alive. It does not grow and develop. Energy processing, that's a big one. We're going to have a whole exam on this. So exam 2 is basically going to be that property of life right there, energy processing. As a matter of fact, most of this semester is somewhere on this slide, right? Most of the stuff we're learning is this. We're learning about the different properties of life, in a sense. But anyway, going back to energy processing, we all process energy. Does anybody know ultimately where all the energy in your body came from? How about not ultimately? How about like, yeah, let's stick with that. Ultimately, where did it come from? Any guesses? I like that. That's good. Because yes, you do get energy from fat. That's the more, I don't want to say recent, but sort of recent. But where did that energy come from? Where did the energy and the fat come from? No guesses? That's all right. The answer is the sun, right? Almost entirely, all the energy in all of the living things on Earth, there are very few exceptions, but there are some exceptions. But anyway, most of it came from the sun. And it had to be processed and changed from one form to another. So some plants turned that solar energy into chemical energy of sugar and other things. And then something ate that plant, maybe you, or maybe the cow that you ate, or something like that, right? So energy changed from one form to another. And inside of you, like he said, you have fat. So if you have stored fat and then you need energy, you break down the chemicals in your fat, and then you change that into a different chemical that you're going to learn about in the next section. I think chapter 5 or 6, you're going to learn about that. But anyway, energy processing, it's a thing. Of course, this does have energy processing, right? I mean, it's not plugged in right now, but when it is plugged in, it's getting DC current, because another thing, here we have this wall outlet that has AC current, but then you have something that adapts it and processes it and changes its DC current. And so this is using the DC current. Of course, prior to that, that energy came from John Amos plant, right down the road. That used to be the chemical energy of coal, but then we burned it and released that as the heat energy, and that heat energy boiled some water, and that turned a turbine, and that was kinetic energy, so on and so forth. So any questions about that? Energy processing. All right, the next one is regulation. Living things can regulate themselves. Some better than others. Like what is the human temperature? What are you supposed to be in Fahrenheit? Right around there, right? 98.6. Because we regulate ourselves. And we're gonna give some other examples as the semester goes on. But yeah, so we'll just leave it at that for now. We'll talk about it more later. Evolution, that's another thing. Life evolves. Not much to say about that. We'll have a whole chapter on that. I will say this, though. This is very important. Life evolves. Individual organisms do not evolve. I have a friend just this weekend who made a post about how evolution is not real and how he presented all this evidence. He kept saying cells can't evolve, cells can't evolve, cells can't evolve, a cell can't evolve. I'm like, dude, you're right. Cells don't evolve. No single organism ever evolves. And you'll see why later. But life itself evolves, which might be confusing, but that's good. I want you to think about that. Like, what the hell is he talking about? So when we get there, you're like, oh, I get it now. Anyway, any questions about that? Life evolves. All right, the next one is reproduction. Oh, and also, right, this doesn't evolve. Well, actually, hold on. One could argue, in a sense, the computers evolve, but not by the strict definition of evolution, which we'll talk about later. Anyway, the next one's reproduction. Obviously, living things reproduce, which is actually one of the things that makes viruses not alive. Speaking of which, a virus has all these properties of life other than the fact they're not cellular. Well, they don't really regulate either. Anyway, viruses aren't alive. That's one of the big ones. That's one of the reasons why viruses can't reproduce. They have to hijack your cellular machinery to reproduce. And then finally, the last one is response to the environment. I don't like the way your book did this, because response to the environment is a lot like regulation. But a good example of that, again, if I said, you found this blob on a beach, is it alive or not? And you poke it, and it moved away from being poked, right? That would be response to the environment. Anyway, any questions about the properties of life? So again, it's very important. You need to know these for the exam. And this is basically what we're going to study throughout the semester. And admittedly, I love biology. Obviously, it's very fascinating, very fun stuff, but we're not going to learn all the really fun stuff. You're going to learn this stuff, right? You're going to learn about cells. You're going to learn about energy processing. It might put you to sleep. It can be boring if you're not into it, but it's important, right? You're going to learn what it means to be alive in this class. So any questions about this slide? All right, the next word for attendance, it's going to be watch. My watch is dead. Watch is the next word for attendance. So if you're online right now, again, send that word sometime before 9 a.m. If you're watching the video, take a screenshot and send that screenshot and the word. All right, if there's no questions, we will do the final main bullet point of chapter 1. This is great news because this is basically a preview of what we're going to talk about throughout the semester. So because of that, I can go through it very quickly because I'm probably not going to test you on any of this directly because we're going to keep talking about it over and over and over throughout the semester. Or in some cases, we're going to get really specific about it later. Like this last bullet point, I'm going to talk about it very quickly, but for this first exam, there'll be 0 questions about evolution. This is a whole chapter where we learn about that at the end, chapter 13. Anyway, the following slides highlight 5 unifying themes reoccurring throughout our investigation of biology. So again, this is just a preview of everything we're going to talk about. Your book has this set up to where every chapter when we're discussing chemistry or evolution or ecology, whatever it may be, these are things that your book is going to bring up. So it's something that we see throughout our study. And the first one is the relationship of structure to function. So does anybody know what this picture is on the left? Good, lungs, right? It's specifically just the airways, just the blood vessels in your lungs. Everything else is stripped away. Does anybody know what things are? Red blood cells. So what's the purpose of lungs? Breathe, right? And what is the purpose of breathing? Good. Specifically how? What are you doing? Like when you breathe in, well, of course, you're breathing in a lot of nitrogen, but when you're breathing in, what is your body after? I think someone said it. Oxygen, good, yes. So when you breathe out, what are you trying to get rid of? Good. So basically, the purpose of your lungs is to exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen, right? And that's why, here we go with the structure and function. The reason why you have all these tiny little blood vessels is because you need a lot of surface area, right? So that the gases can diffuse, the carbon dioxide can leave, and the oxygen can come in. That's the purpose. That's why it has that structure of a lot of surface area, because its function is for gases to diffuse. And what's the purpose of a red blood cell? And I don't expect anybody to know this. I'm just curious if anyone does. Yeah. So this thing, this is where the gas exchanges, and this is the thing that's carrying the oxygen one way, right? So its purpose is to absorb that oxygen. So for the same reason, this thing has a big surface area because it wants to exchange gases. It needs to exchange gases. So do these cells. Same thing. They look different, but in a sense, it's the same structure in that it's a big surface area. Most of your cells don't look like this. Red blood cells do. They have a lot of surface area. Anyway, that's just a great example of structure and function. I'm not going to test you anything. I'm not going to test you on lungs or red blood cells. It's just the idea there is, again, there's a relationship between structure and function, and we're going to see it throughout the semester. Anyway, any questions about that? All right. The next thing we're talking about is information flow. This will be let's see, 1, 2. This will be really important probably in the 3rd exam, but we'll talk about it throughout the semester nonetheless. At all levels of organization, we have information flow. And when I say all levels of organization, what I mean is whether we're talking about a cell or an organism or a population of organisms or a whole ecosystem or the whole world, whichever level we're looking at, there will be information flow. And your book gives us an example, and it is just an example, so read it, but don't memorize it. I'm not going to ask you about this on the exam. But there's information about the amount of glucose in your bloodstream, and that is received by organs such as your pancreas, right? The information flows to your pancreas. And then it responds by releasing insulin, which then regulates the level of glucose in your blood. So again, I'm not going to ask you about that, but it's just a good book example of how information flows. And again, throughout the semester, I'll give examples about that. Any questions? All right. The next way is pathways that transform energy and matter. That's going to be a big one. Basically, that's the 2nd exam. Yeah, chapter 5 is when we're really going to dig into this. Not that you need to write that down. So again, this is just a preview. I'm not going to ask you any questions about this on the 1st exam because we're going to have a whole exam on this, the 2nd exam. But really quickly, we'll talk about it. Like I already said, most ecosystems on Earth are solar powered. almost without exception, all energy and all living things ultimately came from the sun. That's a good independent work topic. If you're curious, you could look up what are the exceptions. Like I said, there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, all the energy comes from the sunlight. And like I already said, plants capture that sunlight energy, they convert it to a chemical energy that we're going to learn about later. All that energy is then stored in the chemical bonds of the stuff that plants make. And of course, we call plant foods, right? So we eat plants or we eat things that eat plants, and we get energy from it, right? By breaking those bonds. When we digest something, we break it down, and as we do, it releases energy and we use it. And of course, we don't just use the energy, but we also use the building blocks to make new molecules. And again, we'll talk about all this later. Same thing here. This is going to be a really important concept later, but some energy is converted to heat. Every time you convert energy from one form to another, you lose some in the form of heat. And we're going to talk about that later. And this one too, we're going to talk about twice later. One in chapter 5 and then one a lot later when we talk about ecosystems. But energy flows through ecosystems and exits as heat. So we get all this solar energy that hits the earth, and eventually it all just leaves as heat. Anyway, any questions about this slide? And again, I'm going through it quickly because this slide we're going to talk about in great detail later. This will not be on the first exam. All right. That's a picture of what I was talking about, how energy flows through an ecosystem and how matter is recycled. Again, we're going to talk about it later, so I don't want to spend any time talking about it right now. The next one, interactions within biological systems. Many interactions happen within and between biological systems. So again, to remind you, when I say systems, what I mean is, we could be looking at a cell. We can be looking at that level. Or we could be looking at a bunch of cells together and how they interact. Or we could be looking at all the organs in an organism and how they interact. Or we could be looking at different organisms, right, and how they interact with each other, like a population of the squirrels on WVSU's campus or something like that. And your book points out that at each new level, the complexity increases. So we're looking at cells. It's very complex. We're looking at how all those organelles are interacting with each other in that cell. That's complex. But then you look at how different cells are interacting with each other. So you're still dealing with how all those organelles are interacting within that one cell. But now you're also dealing with how those cells are interacting with each other, right? So every time you move up, obviously it's going to get more complex. And again, this is something we're going to see throughout the semester. I'm not going to test you on anything that's on this slide. Nonetheless, are there any questions about this slide? All right. I should have had this. This is out of order. This should have been the slide I had at the beginning because I keep describing what a system is, and here's what it is, right? So we start really small. We can look at molecules and atoms, and a bunch of molecules and atoms go together to make organelles, and a bunch of organelles go together to make cells. A bunch of cells interact with each other to make tissues. Tissues make organ systems and organs. Organ systems and organs make organisms. A bunch of organisms together is a population, if they're of the same species, so on and so forth. I'm going to put a big X through this because that just indicates I'm not going to test you on this. But this is also a pretty good map of how we're going to learn biology. We're really going to start here. We're going to learn about molecules and atoms, and chapter 2 is going to be all about chemistry. Then we're going to skip organelles and cells. Well, we're going to skip a lot of this. What you're going to learn is what cells do, right? And then once you've learned what cells do, then we're going to go up and we're going to look at populations and communities and stuff like that. So we're starting small and we're getting bigger. Any questions about that? All right. And then finally, evolution. Again, this is chapter 13. You're going to learn all about it at the end of the semester. I'm going to just briefly cover it right now, but I'm not going to ask you any questions about it on this first exam. There are questions about it on the study guide, but those won't be on the exam. Your book points out that life is distinguished by its unity and diversity. Meaning, if you look at all the different living things, it's obviously it's a lot of diversity, right? There's us, we have humans, and you got things like jellyfish, bacteria, giraffes, right? There's so many different things. So there's a big diversity. However, when you really look at the cellular level, there's also a lot of unity that you're going to be learning about. So even though we're so much different than a banana, for example, we actually have a lot of things in common. Just using that one random example, if anybody wants to look that up for independent work. Specifically our DNA. How much DNA do we have in common with a banana? You might be surprised. It's quite a bit, because that's that unity I'm talking about as opposed to diversity. So the evidence points to life's unity with the similarities among and between fossils and living organisms. And again, we're going to talk about this later. So we can see, when we look at fossils and we look at things that are alive, it's compare and contrast. We can see like, oh, look, they hold these things in common, but they are different in these ways. There's also common processes. So when I put you to sleep with a process called cellular respiration, or even better, fermentation, right? That's something that almost everything does. We'll just leave it at that for now. I'll get more specific and clarify that later. And there's also, again, the universal chemical structure of DNA. So every living thing on Earth has DNA in it. And it's all the same. We all have A's, T's, C's, and G's, which you're going to learn about. Those are the 4 bases of DNA, and they're all the same. So if you look at all the A's in your genome, it's all the same as all the A's in his genome, and all the A's in my genome, and all the A's in a banana's genome, right? An A is an A. So the explanation for the fact that we have all this unity, but also diversity, is evolution. And evolution is the process of change that has transformed life from the earliest forms to the vast array of organisms that we have today. And again, we're going to have a whole chapter on evolution. And we're going to focus a lot on natural selection, which is just one of the ways that things evolve. But again, we'll get there later. Any questions about this slide? Okay, so every book in your chapter, because evolution is so important, ends with the evolution connection. So at the end of every chapter, they're going to have a little thing called the evolution connection. And just like that other section that they have in every chapter, which is the process of science, I'm going to skip it every time. So you can read about it, but there won't be any questions about it on the exam. There might be questions about it on the study guide. So yeah, read it. Let me know if you have any questions. And let's say the last word for attendance is going to be, green. Like where you can see come on. Sorry, if I get this to work. Anyway, yeah, green is the last word for attendance, and that's it. So we got done a little bit early today. Any questions about anything? If you came in late, make sure you email me to let me know you came in late so I can have you down for attendance. And I think that's it. Yeah. So I'll see you at noon if you are section 1.
You have a list of sections?
Not on me, but if you don't know your section, check my state and or send me an email, and I'll email you back and let you know what section you are. Wherever your schedule is. So if you look at your schedule where it shows all your classes, it'll show you like 101-01 or 101-02. Is it?
Yeah.
That stinks.
Especially this semester, you have to go to My State, My Student Profile, change it to spring 2023, and then you can click course.
You don't have a schedule? Oh, what about week at a glance?
That works.
Week at a glance works? I'm trying to remember, in fact, when I was a student.
You did say you did send me an email. You're going to.
I'm going to, yeah.
Okay, and will that have like your office hours and stuff?
Yep.
Sounds good.